In June 1969, a Douglas DC-8 passenger aircraft, popular in the mid-20th century, landed at Madrid Airport. On board were about 200 passengers, but we are only interested in one person who did not check in for the flight, did not check any luggage, and did not eat a single pack of peanuts during the flight. His lifeless body, lying on the concrete runway next to the landing gear, was discovered by the plane's pilot. At that moment, the man's clothing was covered in ice, and his body temperature was so low that typically at such readings, a person is already considered dead. This incident raised numerous questions for the Spanish authorities, primarily two. First, the very fact of survival contradicted everything known to medicine. Doctors at the Madrid hospital could not provide a definitive explanation for what had happened. They proposed various versions and hypotheses, but none offered a clear answer. Second, it was necessary to determine who this person was, what country he came from, and how he ended up on the runway in Spain, as he was not among the passengers in the cabin. It soon became clear that behind this mysterious episode from half a century ago lay something more than just a scientifically inexplicable miracle, though that alone would be enough for an intriguing story. Above all, this story is about an entire country. It is a story of courage and despair. It is a story of how freedom triumphs over fear. A moment after discovering the frozen body, the pilot concluded that he was looking at a corpse. The man appeared completely stiff. He called for the on-duty medics who carried the motionless passenger inside the airport building. This was done not to provide assistance, but merely to wait for specialists and send the body to the morgue. At that moment, the young man, who was considered hopelessly dead, barely moved his lips, uttering something indistinct. Later, the victim would recall this moment. According to him, everything around was blurred and moving. Not just the people running about, but even the walls, windows, and ceiling. The astonished medics urgently transported the foundling to the hospital, and just a couple of days later, he was calmly playing cards with the police officers assigned to him. It turned out that the rescued individual was named Armando Ramirez. The police quickly established that the young man was 17 years old and a citizen of Cuba. He had flown to Madrid, hiding in the landing gear compartment of the plane, a feat that neither the police nor the doctors could initially explain. The main question remained unanswered. How did Armando survive at all? According to all scientific understanding, he should have perished. Flying on a passenger aircraft had long ceased to be a miracle. It is a complex, technological, yet entirely mundane process. Take off, watch a movie, sleep, use the restroom, snack on an unappetizing sandwich, and land thousands of kilometers from the departure point. Easy. But while passengers can enjoy the clouds outside their windows during a comfortable flight, on the other side of the window, there are distinct traces of frost. At that very moment, the plane is approximately 10 kilometers above the ground, where the temperature outside is around 50 degrees Celsius, and there is virtually no oxygen in the air. For people in the cabin, this is not a problem. Complex systems maintain normal temperature and oxygen levels inside. However, in the landing gear compartment, where our hero presumably traveled, none of this exists. What does a person feel when they climb into the landing gear compartment? Approximately 20 to 30 minutes after takeoff, the plane reaches that height of about 10 kilometers. By this time, the landing gear has warmed up during the takeoff run. So initially, the temperature inside the compartment will be not 50, but slightly warmer, around 35 degrees Celsius. More pleasant, but still insufficient for survival. The body temperature, without any protection, will begin to drop rapidly below the level at which the body can function at all. The pressure at an altitude of 10 kilometers is 4 times lower than at ground level. Because of this, the oxygen content in the thin air is also extremely low. The lungs of a person sitting in the landing gear do not receive enough air. The blood does not get enough oxygen, and their organs are deprived as well, leading inevitably to heart failure or brain death. I think the logic is clear. Oxygen is vital, and surviving in a landing gear compartment not designed for humans is impossible. Moreover, there is another important point. In order to even encounter all these lethal factors, a person must first not fall out of the compartment during takeoff before the landing gear doors close and not be crushed by those enormous wheels, each over 1 meter in diameter and weighing more than 100 kilograms. In short, if you have the option, it's better to buy a ticket and fly in the cabin. But when such an option is not available, and the desire to leave the country is so strong that it overrides the fear of death, that very desire drives a person to push the boundaries of what is possible. On that June day in 1969, only one frozen body was found at the Madrid Airport. However, there were originally supposed to be 2. To understand how this happened, let's rewind the story a bit further back. Jose Marti International Airport, Havana, Cuba. A month before the escape, 2 teenagers began to visit regularly. Armando Ramirez was 17 years old, and his friend Jose was a year younger. Both were determined to escape their country at any cost, which by that time had completely turned into a dictatorship under Fidel Castro. The friends quickly noticed that every plane at the airport followed the same scenario. It slowly taxied to the runway, briefly stopped, and then suddenly accelerated, ultimately lifting off the ground. The short pause before takeoff was precisely the moment when one could manage to climb into the landing gear compartment. The guys knew a little about the pressure and temperature at altitude, but they clearly understood the cost of failure. If you didn't jump in time, you would be crushed to death by the giant wheels. You might survive, but get caught by security. Then it would mean years in prison and the label of a traitor, a worm, as those who attempted to flee the country were derogatorily called in Cuba. The friends prepared for their escape as best as they could. They chose a suitable flight, Havana to Madrid, one of the few that flew to a country unfriendly to Cuba. If they had flown, say, to Moscow or Prague, they would have been immediately returned, resulting in subsequent years in prison and the shame of being traitor worms. On June 3, 1969, Armando and Jose put on shoes with rubber non-slip soles, stocked up on pieces of cotton for their ears, and took a rope to tie themselves inside the compartment. When the right plane taxied onto the runway, they dashed through the airport's barrier. Armando managed to climb into the right landing gear compartment. His friend was supposed to get into the left one. Whether his friend succeeded or not, Armando did not see. The plane shuddered and began to gain speed. Settling into the cramped space, Armando braced himself for takeoff. At that moment, the young man suddenly felt himself being pressed by the scorching wheels. The pilot, of course, had no idea what was happening in one of the landing gear compartments. He only noticed that he couldn't retract the landing gear after takeoff. The commander of the aircraft decided to make one more attempt to retract the landing gear before returning to the airport in an emergency. In the meantime, Armando huddled deeper into the available space of the compartment and froze in anticipation. On the second attempt, the landing gear finally closed. A feeling of euphoria washed over the fugitive. Armando did not yet know what awaited him ahead. He also did not know that his partner had failed to jump onto the plane. His friend was caught by airport security, handed over to the police, and would spend the next several years in prison. Thus began the story of Armando Ramirez. However, it is still unclear how he managed to survive in conditions incompatible with life and how it all unfolded later. To fully understand this story, it is worth pausing for a moment and looking at its context. Cuba is a country where all power is concentrated in the hands of one person. A country where there are no independent media outlets, only state propaganda. A country where dissenters are thrown into prisons. A country where a large part of the population is poor and disenfranchised. This is precisely about Cuba. At first, Fidel Castro appeared as a romantic revolutionary, a colorful guy with a thick beard, his signature cigar, and fiery slogans. In 1959, he, along with his comrades, including Che Guevara, overthrew the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, who was supported by the United States. Fidel promised freedom, reforms, industrialization, and prosperity. He was supported not only by millions of Cubans, but also by many Western intellectuals, such as Ernest Hemingway and Bob Dylan. However, good intentions quickly collided with reality. Hostility with America began. Friendship with the Soviet Union emerged, and the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted. A couple of years after Castro came to power, food shortages started in Cuba, followed by mass political repression and total nationalization. By the end of the 1960s, the country had fully become a dictatorship, this time communist, with Fidel himself at the helm. Cuba has been in roughly this state for the last 60 years, up to the present day, except that starting from the 1990s, the country's economy became even weaker. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant the loss of Havana's main ally and trading partner, which made life extremely difficult for the Cubans. For the residents of Cuba who did not share Fidel's political views, there were two choices: to flee or to accept their situation. Many preferred the latter, viewing Castro as an unpleasant but almost natural disaster. There was no way around it. For most of the second half of the 20th century, leaving the island legally was nearly impossible. Only a few times over the 60 years did Castro decide to release some steam of discontent and allowed all dissenters to leave the country. If you don't like it, then get out. Each time, hundreds of thousands of people took advantage of this opportunity. The population of Cuba is about 10 million. But even during those brief periods when immigration was allowed, not everyone who wanted to leave managed to get on a plane or a ship. How else could one escape from an island located in the Caribbean Sea, just a stone's throw from the shores of America? One option was to use a makeshift raft. In fact, not just any small raft, but one made by hand. Many Cubans literally constructed rafts from available materials. The task was complicated by a total shortage of supplies. Obtaining everything necessary for the boat was difficult and dangerous. You could be suspected of intending to flee and reported to the authorities. However, if you managed to successfully navigate this stage of the quest without anyone discovering your plans, you could set sail. The journey from the shores of Cuba to Miami can hardly be called an exciting adventure. It has always been harsh and often tragic. On the map, the distance looks small, but in reality, it is about 160 kilometers of water filled with dangers. To give you an idea of the scale, in the last half-century, nearly 100,000 people have died in these waters. This figure speaks volumes about how desperately many wanted to escape and how difficult this ordeal was. So, the first hurdle that the balseros, as the fugitives on homemade rafts were called, had to overcome was the Cuban Coast Guard. It monitors about 20 kilometers of sea from the shore. Beyond that lies international waters and the main threats: waves several meters high that capsize boats, sharks, which often attack people in open boats, and the daytime heat, followed by nighttime chill, which poses risks of dehydration or hypothermia. Finally, there is the U.S. Coast Guard. When Americans caught fugitives at sea, they did indeed take them to the United States, but only to deport them back. The U.S. was not particularly welcoming to refugees from the island of freedom. In the early 1960s, asylum was granted to almost all Cubans, including those who arrived by boat. But then for several decades, the wet foot, dry foot policy was implemented. The essence of this policy was that if you managed to survive for several days without sinking, being eaten by sharks, or dying of thirst, and ultimately reached the shores of the U.S., literally to dry land, then welcome to the United States. However, if the U.S. Coast Guard caught you still in the water, there was a high probability you would be deported. Many Cubans who attempted to escape by swimming did not even make it to the American Coast Guard. They were either caught by their own or perished along the way. This method of fleeing on a homemade raft became widespread closer to the 1990s. However, in the late 1960s, when Armando Ramirez planned to fly away hidden in an airplane's landing gear, such an option hardly crossed anyone's mind. Firstly, obtaining spare parts, including a motor for the boat, was nearly impossible. Secondly, it was a brief period when there were special flights that transported all dissenters to the States. Over a few years, about 200,000 people were able to leave this way, though the number of those who wanted to escape was about 4 times greater. 2 ordinary Cuban teenagers understood that their turn would likely never come. So, they decided to take fate into their own hands. We already know what happened to Armando Ramirez's friend, but what was happening to him when the landing gear doors finally closed and the plane began to rapidly ascend to the altitude at which a person cannot survive without special technology. Immediately after takeoff, Armando experienced euphoria. However, this feeling was quickly drowned out by the deafening roar of the engines and the cold that penetrated his body more intensely. The teenager didn't have time to tie himself with a rope after the landing gear closed. The space was so cramped that he could hardly move. The only thing he managed to do was to hook his leg, and it was this that prevented him from falling out when the plane lifted off the ground. The cotton balls in his ears did not shield him from the roar of the engines, but soon the main problem became the biting cold. For a brief period, while the landing gear retained warmth right after takeoff, the temperature in the compartment was still somewhat bearable. However, the wheels gradually cooled down. It is unlikely that Armando imagined how long the flight would be. The journey from Havana to Madrid takes nearly 10 hours, and for most of that time, the plane flies at a great altitude. Armando was freezing and gradually losing consciousness. Images of his father and their small, poor apartment on the outskirts of the Cuban capital floated through his mind. He recalled his friend Jose, whom they had met at a baseball game. He thought about how the guys had gone to the airport several times to watch the planes take off, trying to figure out if a person could fit inside the landing gear compartment. He remembered how just an hour ago, he and his friend had been riding their bicycles through their hometown towards the airport. These memories became the last thing Armando remembered from his flight. He spent the rest of the time on the plane unconscious at an altitude of several kilometers above the Atlantic Ocean. The medical staff at the Madrid hospital nicknamed the unusual patient Icicle. The doctors speculated that at high altitude, Armando experienced a state of deep freezing. All processes in his body were put on pause, and as the plane descended, his body gradually thawed, restarting vital functions. However, this was merely a hypothesis. No one could provide a precise explanation for what had happened. The word miracle appeared suspiciously often in the experts' conjectures. For the doctors, it was a medical miracle, while for the aviation technicians, it was a technical one. Not being crushed by the landing gear and not falling out of the compartment during landing while unconscious was a chance of about 1 in a million. At that time, no one could imagine what consequences this miracle would have for Armando Ramirez himself. More than half a century has passed since then. Medicine and technology have advanced significantly, but a case like Armando Ramirez's story is still regarded as a true miracle. Doctors still do not have a definitive explanation for how such a thing is possible. As it turned out, Armando was not the only person in aviation history to survive a flight in the landing gear compartment. Such cases were extremely rare, but they did occur, meaning it is possible to attempt to find certain patterns among them. Let's turn to the statistics. Throughout the history of aviation, there have not been many people who dared to travel in such an extreme way. The landing gear compartment is not like a trolley bus, where it's easy to sneak in as a fare dodger. The first recorded attempt by a person to use an airplane in this manner occurred in 1947. Since then, there have been only 128 such cases worldwide, with 80% of them ending tragically. However, the remaining escapees did survive. How did they manage to pull off such a trick? To answer this question, we must venture into the realm where physics and medicine intersect. Certainly not the most comfortable place for a humanities scholar. Earlier, we described what happens to a person's body at an altitude of 10 kilometers. There is terrifying cold and virtually no oxygen. Even these two factors are usually enough to lead to death. After all, no one climbs into the landing gear compartment wearing a warm coat and carrying an oxygen tank. And besides, none of that would even fit in there. So, what can happen to the body under such conditions? According to doctors, the key factor is a sharp drop in body temperature to around 27 degrees or lower, with a normal range of 36 to 37 degrees. This difference is critical for the body's functioning. At that moment, the body essentially enters a state of hibernation. The activity of all life-supporting systems slows down dramatically, leaving only the most essential functions. The pulse drops to an absolute minimum, and the body's need for energy and oxygen decreases just as sharply. As a result, some people manage to survive even with an oxygen volume that would be incompatible with life under normal conditions. One remarkable case from 2011 supports this theory. It occurred not in the sky, but on the water, yet the logic is similar. A group of Danish school children, along with their teachers, went on a field trip to explore the fjords. Suddenly, the boat capsized, and most of the people spent nearly 2 hours in the cold water waiting for help. The water temperature was around 2 degrees. Under certain pressure, salty seawater can remain liquid even at sub-zero temperatures. When the freezing teenagers were pulled from the water, most had a body temperature below 19 degrees C, and their hearts were not beating. They were essentially dead. In the hospital, they were gradually warmed up, their bodies saturated with oxygen, and other resuscitation procedures were performed. As a result, most of the kids survived and returned to a normal life. Yes, due to brain damage, their cognitive abilities suffered slightly. Their academic performance became a bit lower than before the incident. But even with this caveat, we are dealing with an incredible event, a true miracle that remains largely unexplained by science. It turns out that all those plots in Hollywood movies where people are frozen and then come back to life are not so far-fetched after all. We can confidently say that everyone who managed to survive such escapes in the landing gear compartment is truly favored by fate, and Armando Ramirez was doubly fortunate. If we take a close look at the list of such episodes throughout history, it becomes evident that the highest percentage of survivors occurred in the very first cases, before the 1960s. The logic here is clear. Back then, airplanes flew at significantly lower altitudes and flight durations were much shorter. Consequently, the potential risk of dying from hypothermia or lack of oxygen was lower. However, the plane that Armando was on climbed to nearly 8 kilometers, and the flight lasted about 10 hours. Another fortunate factor is age. The overwhelming majority of stowaways in the landing gear who managed to survive were around 20 years old or younger. The example of the Danish school children supports this pattern. Apparently, a young body has a better chance of recovering after such a freeze, although it is also possible that this is merely a statistical anomaly. By the way, the average age of those 128 brave souls is also quite low. Older individuals tend to prefer traveling in comfort. Of course, everyone wants to know what happened next to Armando Ramirez. It's time to share that story. To the surprise of the doctors at the Madrid hospital, their patient recovered quite quickly. For the first month, he couldn't hear anything, but then his hearing returned. 52 days after the incident, Armando left the hospital completely healthy. Subsequently, Armando moved to America. In 2021, at the age of 69, he gave an interview and shared that he is living a happy life. He has 4 children and 12 grandchildren, and his health is perfectly fine. It seems that his daring escape did not have any serious consequences for him. Moreover, in the United States, Armando worked as a firefighter for over 10 years, an occupation that demands very high health standards from its practitioners. No matter what the doctors say, Armando himself is convinced that his story of survival is a 100% miracle. Has the situation in Cuba changed since then? Not particularly. Despite the death of Fidel Castro, Cuba remains a very poor country, facing a constant shortage of food and essential goods, with state propaganda and terrible internet access, or even a complete lack of it. One of Fidel's most famous slogans was "Patria o muerte," which translates from Spanish to "homeland or death." Over the past half-century, a vast number of Cubans have chosen escape and even